So the next one, another chart here, or another table. So, like I said, always read the title, The Effect of World War II on Industry. Give it a quick look. Which of the following best explains why the war, so World War II, had the effect on industry indicated by the chart? So if you look at this chart, obviously manufacturing is increasing, corporate profits are increasing. If manufacturing increases, corporate profits are going to increase. And then even after taxes, they're still going to go up. I mean, that's just kind of how the way it works. So you want to look at the questions here. This one, so even before the United States entered the war, the United States entered the war in 1941 after Pearl Harbor. So 1941, here's when we're going to enter the war. Did they increase sharply? Not really. You only went up about 16. So not a lot. And then, up a little bit more here. So really not, it didn't increase sharply by any means. Sharply would be like if it went from 100 to 200 to 300, that would be a sharp increase. But it's not. So even, income and profits, not that big. So manufacturing output increased by over 50% in 2 years. It kind of did, but it didn't just like sharply increase. So, the output went from 100 to 154 in a couple years. I mean, that's a question that it's kind of tough because that could be an answer, but it might not be the best answer. So next, the war created a huge demand for military equipment and supplies. So looking at this, manufacturing jumped, it went up. It went from 100 to 116, which is only 16 points, up to 154, which is a pretty good increase. So here's where we went into the war, 1941. So there's a pretty sharp increase on demand, and that's what's important is supply and demand. The men gone to serve as soldiers, more women were employed in the factories. Okay, that just has nothing to do with anything. That there's nothing in this chart that would explain anything about this. This is just completely extraneous, meaning useless information. It's not there. So looking at this, the United States, we could kind of check this one out. Doesn't go. I would say that manufacturing output increased, but it's just not, the information's not there to tell us if that's a true statement. So we go ahead and click that one out. But we know for a fact, absolute fact, that demand jumped for military equipment. So we're going to go ahead and check that one. And then obviously this one you can go ahead and ignore. So that's kind of your answer for that. Sometimes it's easy to get lost in the two because there might be two good answers. But you have to pick the one that's better supported. Okay, so the next one might be good too to go through the practice tests and find, we can get it for you a vocabulary sheet because sometimes they use wording that you may have heard, like in the news and things like that, but you might not know exactly what it means. So it's good to kind of know some of the questions, answers, and then some of the vocabulary. I suggest that for any of the GED tests, just because there's a lot of vocabulary that you might not have heard a lot, but you've heard it, but you don't know what it means, and it's good to know what it means. So this one's kind of a good example of that. So the U.S. president, so our president, has a great deal of influence over foreign policy, meaning how we deal with other countries and how they deal with us. In part, this is because international relations often require quick and decisive actions, which is best undertaken by an individual. They're saying that if you have a group of people trying to do something, it's one of those too many cooks in the kitchen kind of thing, and people get lost and they fight among themselves, where if one person can decide quickly and decisively, make a quick, hey, this is the answer we need to do. So that's why the president has a great deal of influence over foreign policy and doesn't necessarily have to ask other people about it. In times of foreign crisis, the public usually rallies to the support of the president, at least at first. So, meaning that we as the American people will usually decide, like, yeah, that was a good idea at the time. Like that happens in times of war. If we're attacked, usually people are like, hey, we need to attack back. So that's kind of how that works. And then down the road, as people have more time to think about it, they're like, maybe that wasn't the best action. But usually people jump behind their government and support it for the most part. Obviously, it's not always true, but for the most part. So which of the following which of the following ideas underlies Americans, us, the people, initial approval, like us saying, yeah, the president made the right call on that one, during emergency foreign policy actions? So, in a lot of these, patriotism is generally the idea that the people will rally around what they call rally around the flag, and that's the idea that people will support the president initially. So that one, if you look up patriotism and kind of know what it means, this is your answer right there. You don't have to really look at the other ones if you know that's the answer. Imperialism is usually the idea that a bigger country will try to conquer a smaller country. So that doesn't really fit in here. Because we're not trying to necessarily conquer somebody. That would be more like what you would see during like early China and early, like some of the early societies where they would just try to conquer each other and claim land. So that doesn't really fit. Self-expression doesn't really make much sense. We're not trying to express ourselves. We're following the president and what they think. Self-sacrifice, not really sacrificing anything. The president's not like sacrificing himself. We're not sacrificing ourselves. They might be sacrificing like their personal ideas for the betterment of the people, but it really doesn't fit. So patriotism's your answer for that one. So number 10, to combat the anti-competitive nature of monopolies or trusts, such as U.S. Steel, Standard Oil, and American Tobacco Company, the U.S. Congress passed the Sherman Antitrust Act in 1890. So basically what that means is to combat and fight like one company owning one like huge portion of something. For example, say like if you had Microsoft and they were the only ones owned and made computers, then we're kind of saying, hey, we have to have other companies to compete with them, so they aren't creating a monopoly. So that's what they're doing. Sherman Antitrust Act basically is what they're doing is saying, hey, we can't have this as a monopoly. We can't let one company own everything and control it, because then it just doesn't make it fair for the consumers, us. So that act made it illegal. So the Sherman Antitrust Act made it illegal for an individual or company to monopolize or conspire to monopolize an industry to act with others to restrain trade or commerce among the states or abroad. While the Sherman Antitrust Act was and remains very influential, it was very important, it wasn't sufficient to solve all of the problems raised by monopolies. Because of its broad language, meaning it had very loose language, it wasn't very specific, in its focus on the intent to create monopolies. So the idea that companies had this plan to create monopolies, and it was focusing on that, not so much the ones that were happening. Courts interpreted the Sherman Antitrust Act differently and inconsistently in many cases to which it applied. As a result, Congress passed the Clayton Act in 1914. So they're providing another one to piggyback off of this, which targeted very specific actions such as favorable price discrimination, exclusive dealings and contracts, and that were used to create monopolies. So the second one, the Clayton Act, is focusing a lot more and paring down the language. in the passage above, what are we seeing with the writer? What's his main point? So, in this whole thing, what is this writer trying to say? So, court struck down the Sherman Antitrust Act because its broad language made it unconstitutional. If you look in here, it doesn't say anything about the Constitution, it doesn't say that it was struck down. It says that it was there, it was a good idea, but it just didn't necessarily work as well as they'd hoped. So that's not your answer. Problems with consistently enforcing the Sherman Antitrust Act led to further legislation to prevent monopolies. So that's your answer. The reason that's your answer is because it's stated right here. So it wasn't sufficient, right here. So the Clayton Act was created because of that. So that's your answer. We can go ahead and read the other ones. Monopolies successfully avoided prosecution. Doesn't say that anywhere. Doesn't say they were prosecuted or anything like that. It did. Obviously, the Sherman Act didn't do what it was supposed to do. So it didn't stop monopolies or anything like that. So obviously, that's not going to be your answer either. So that's kind of how you look at that one. You're going to get a lot of these questions. You're also going to get these on the language arts that they're going to be asking you to understand the author's reasoning and what they're trying to get in that.